at being able to get to know the region intimately and to understand the dynamics of the situation that are there. We have a very troubled relationship. The United States has a very troubled relationship with Iran, and has now for practically all the time that I've been professionally involved with that country. And I'd like to try to explain that to you, and then begin to talk about many more contemporary issues that are involved with the situation with Iran. But it's really impossible for us to talk about the contemporary situation without understanding the historical situation that we've faced with Iran. The historical situation is very complex and very old. And many Americans sometimes think that our difficulty with Iran is something that happened last week or last month or maybe last year, but it's not. It goes back a long, long time. So let me start. I'm going to go very briefly and quickly through the historical material so that we can talk about the more contemporary situation. And so if I move too quickly, let me catch up with some of your questions when we get to the end of my talk, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So we have to start in dealing with the Iranian situation with something much more, broader, and that is the 19th century, the great empires of the 19th century. And you can see on this map the Ottoman Sultanate. The Ottoman Empire extended all the way to Morocco and way into Europe and to the northern part of the Black Sea. And then to its east was the Persian Empire. And both of these were dominant in the world. They were extremely wealthy, and for centuries, for 5 centuries, they were in many ways, they're much more civilized in their early period than, for instance, Elizabethan England. And they, as I say, were very wealthy. But what happened in the 19th century is we had the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was a shock to both the Ottoman Empire and to the Persian Empire at the time, because it gave Europe an economic and a military advantage over the Middle East in all ways, in terms of economic production, also military technology, so that the military forces in the Middle East were absolutely no match for the military forces of Europe. So in dealing with the Industrial Revolution, the Middle Eastern rulers became nearly bankrupt, especially the Europeans setting up factories. They would import raw material from the Middle East and manufacture it, turn it into manufactured goods, and would actually sell it back to the Middle East. So for instance, work in textiles was completely destroyed as a result of the revolution. So the rulers solved their problems by creating concessions for Europeans. And this meant that they were actually selling the patrimony of their own nations. They sold licenses to European entrepreneurs for everything, for the development of banks, for transportation systems, for communication systems, for manufacture, and for agricultural products. And this was great for the rulers because the rulers
you could watch an episode of The Wire.
Hi, would everyone please mute their microphones so that we can not have a lot of crosstalk. Thank you. So that this was great for the rulers because they got a lot of cash directly from the Europeans. It was great for the Europeans. They had economic exploitation of the region, but for the people, it was really disastrous because essentially their patrimony was being sold out from under them by their own rulers. So the backlash was the Islamic movement of the 19th century. And all Islamic movements today stem from this backlash against the colonial powers. And so you have to understand that these movements, the Islamic movements, are directed at non-Middle Easterners, but they are also directed at the rulers that existed in the Middle East and continue to exist. The so-called Arab Spring was an offshoot of this same situation, where people rebelled against their own rulers who they thought were actually colluding with the non-Middle Eastern powers, with Europeans in particular, to exploit the people of the region. So this continued until World War I, and the Ottoman Empire, to its great misfortune, sided with Germany during World War I with the Axis powers, and as a result, Great Britain and France, after the Ottoman Empire and the Axis powers lost, the Great Britain and France divided up the Ottoman territory. So they had no interest in the welfare of the people in this region. Their own economic interests were paramount. And oil was the big factor from the very, very beginning. The British needed petroleum in order to fuel their warships in the Indian Ocean and to protect their Indian empire. The British and the French didn't concern themselves with the local conflict that might be taking place in the area with different ethnic groups or different religious groups, because they had armies stationed throughout the region, and they felt that those armies were always going to be able to take care of any kind of uprising that might take place. But little did they know that they couldn't stay there forever. The armies of Britain and Great Britain and France were expelled during the 1950s in a whole series of revolutions. They were expelled from Egypt, they were expelled from Iraq, they were expelled from Syria, and also from Lebanon. So the European powers withdrew, and as a result, we have a lot of conflict in the Middle East. And why? Because what the British and the French did was essentially create entirely new countries in this area. Here's the Sykes-Picot Agreement, famous from 1916, which divided the region up into zones that were controlled by the British and by the French. The great archaeologist and spy T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was one of the first people to draw a map of new nations in the region that were being created out of whole cloth by the British and by the French. And for example, Iraq is a country that is cobbled together out of three former Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. And these three provinces had never existed together under one state. They were provinces of the Ottoman Empire, but the way the Ottomans ruled, they were virtually independent of each other. Mosul is primarily a Kurdish region. Baghdad was a Sunni region with Baghdad as a capital, and all of that green territory to the west is mostly desert. And Basra was a Shia territory in southern Iraq. So you have the Shia in southern Iraq, you have Sunnis in the middle, and you have Kurds in the north, and these three groups had never ever had to live together. But as long as the British Army was there, it wasn't a problem. If you take a look at the ethnic groups in Iraq, you'll see that the green are Shia, the orange, or the pink, there are Kurds, and the rest are Sunnis, and they have had a very, very uneasy relationship with each other ever since. If we take a look at a place like Lebanon today, Lebanon was created entirely by the French out of a former sub-province of Syria, and the French wanted to give the Maronite Christians a place that they could rule. So the Maronite Christians, which constitute only about 16% of the population, were written into the Constitution of Lebanon by the French to always have the presidency of the country and always be the rulers of the country, even though they only constituted 16% of the population. The largest population in Lebanon are Shia Muslims, and this is one of the problems that we have to encounter later with regard to Iran, because the Shia community was always disadvantaged and under siege in Lebanon. If you take a look at Syria, you see the same kind of thing. The Alawite community is a Shia offshoot in the Shia offshoot in living in Syria. And the Alawites have another story. They actually came over the years after the withdrawal of the French to dominate the army of Syria. And so Bashar al-Assad, whose father was ruler of Iraq, is the result of the Alawites dominating the armed forces and therefore creating a situation where they were a minority ruling over a majority. It's exactly this kind of dynamic that Britain and France didn't care anything about, and as a result created essentially chaos in the region. Here's another map showing ethnic groups in Syria. But this is just a backdrop to our situation with regard to Iran. Now, Iran is very different from these other regions that were dominated by Great Britain and France, and yet in many ways it's the same. Iran was a unified territory. It has had integrity as a territory for centuries and centuries, and it's the home to a very ancient and very rich civilization that has extended its influence all the way to India and all the way into Central Asia, and to a great extent into the Ottoman Empire itself. It was not only it was an integrated nation with a rich culture, but it also had great difficulties with European and U.S. powers over the last 150 years. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and skip over a whole period of history to talk about the revolution of 1978 and 1979, because our difficulties with Iran begin at that time, at the revolution of 1978 and 1979. Iran was effectively ruled by Great Britain and by Russia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. But in 1948, after World War II, the United States deposed the ruler, Reza Shah, and installed his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. Mohammad Reza Shah was a very young ruler. He was addicted to fast cars and women and all kinds of westernized pleasures, but he was not really ready to rule the country. Nevertheless, he was installed by the United States. In 1952, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was elected, and he nationalized the Iranian oil company, which alarmed the British and the United States. And as a result of his efforts, there was a popular uprising in Iran that forced the Shah into exile. In 1952, again, the United States and Great Britain, the MI6 agency, engineered a counter coup to depose Mossadegh and reinstall the Shah to power. There's simply no question about this. The CIA was directly involved with this. It's extremely well documented, and it's something that the Iranians will never forget, although most Americans are blissfully unaware of the fact that our government was directly involved with the deposition of a duly elected, democratically elected ruler who simply opposed the United States and Great Britain because of their interests in the oil industry in Iran. Now the next stage after the Shah had been restored to power was a partnership between the United States and Iran, where the United States got involved with the development of all kinds of projects in Iran. Now, the reason that we did was that we were afraid of the Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War. And the United States had a policy of trying to engage in development projects throughout the world in order to make sure that the Soviet Union would not gain a foothold in these areas. And they were particularly concerned about Iran, first because right after World War II, the Soviet Union had tried to annex a couple of provinces of Iran. They were eventually expelled, but also because the United States was deathly afraid that the Soviet Union would invade the region and would push all the way to the Persian Gulf, where they would be able to take advantage of the oil industry in the Persian Gulf and control energy resources for the United States and for the rest of the world. So we were petrified about this, and we thought that the best way to prevent the Soviet Union from making inroads was to provide economic assistance and development to Iran and to other countries in the region. But Iran was the kind of the big prize, both for the Soviet Union and for the United States. Now, if you remember, in the 19th century, Russia already had a strong interest in Iran, and they effectively ruled the country through influence up until the time of World War I. So they had a long history of doing this. So in 1972, Great Britain withdraws from the Persian Gulf region. The expenses of maintaining these small countries in the Persian Gulf region, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and the 7 emirates that make up today the United Arab Emirates, was, along with Oman, got to be just too expensive. And so so Great Britain withdrew from the region, and the United States became extremely alarmed about this, because the British were an important bulwark against Soviet influence in the area. Once again, this was the Cold War. And so the United States, as a counter move, after the British withdrew, established what we called the Twin Pillars policy. And that was where Iran and Saudi Arabia would serve as defense against the incursion of the Soviet Union. And the United States then would sell arms both to Saudi Arabia and to Iran on a massive scale in order to be able to, for them to be able to improve their armed forces and their defense. But again, as an ally of the United States during the Cold War. So the money for these arms sales to Iran and to Saudi Arabia came from a very interesting source, because what happened as soon as the United States agreed to sell arms to these countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, OPEC, raised the price of oil. They had the ability to do that. They raised the price of oil. The prices in the United States just shot up like crazy. Some of you may be old enough to remember standing in line at gas tanks in the United States as the prices shot up. And effectively, the American consumer paid for those arms that were sold to Iran. The money went to Iran. Iran turned around and used the money to buy arms from the United States. So we weren't giving the arms to Iran. Iran was paying for those arms, but in fact, the American consumer was the original purchaser of those arms. That's where the money came from. So in 1973 to 1978, after the Shah had received all of his military equipment from the United States, he used the military equipment not only to protect Iran against the Soviet Union, but also to repress his own people. And this was a period of time when the Shah's arrests of people who were dissenting against his rule got to be extremely extensive and quite brutal. So and the United States was utterly complicit in this period of time. We didn't stop the Shah from doing anything or call him on anything because, after all, he was our friend and he was protecting the region from Soviet influence. So we saw what the Shah was doing was essentially working in our interests, and at the same time ignoring what he might have been doing to his own people. So in 1978, 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution, and the Shah was deposed again. From the Iranian view, there was a breach of hierarchical responsibility. That is, Iran was abused, Iranians were abused by their rulers along with being abused by the United States. Once again, the 19th century dynamic where the people were being abused both by their rulers and by an outside colonial power is replicated here in the Iranian Revolution, almost 100 years after the first Islamic revolution was established in the 19th century. From the American view, the United States didn't really have much knowledge or understanding of this history. So they felt like they were helping Iran modernize, and so Iran should be grateful. The Shah then in the United States the Shah and the United States, from the standpoint of the revolutionaries in Iran, had abandoned the Iranian people when the army actually fired on protesters, unarmed women and children. Then the end was near for the Shah. And from the American view, well, people choose their own rulers, and they tolerated the Shah, and so it's not the Shah's fault that people didn't want him anymore, and the United States was utterly unconcerned about the revolution, except for the fact that they were losing an ally, and that was the difficulty of the situation. And so the Iranians felt that the United States was having materialistic motives in their friendship with Iran, that they weren't really concerned about the Iranian people. But from the American standpoint, the market prevails, everyone operates in their own best interests. The marketplace is an orderly way to conduct international relations. And so we don't need to be concerned about things like whether people are really being paid attention to, or what spiritual needs people might have. So it's important now for us to understand a little bit about the parties who are in the revolution, because they continue to be important in the current situation with regard to the United States and Iran. First of all, there were the secular nationalists. These were people who had been around for a very, very long time. They had no religious interests, and at the very first, right after the revolution, they were the ones who were in power. They were in power for about 6 months after the revolution started. They had no religious affiliation, and they were trying to return Iran to the state that it was in when Prime Minister Mossadegh was the prime minister, a secular democracy. There were also the Marxist Islamists that were trying to turn Iran into a Marxist state, and with some kinds of Islamic sensibilities. And these include, and this is the very important organization, please remember this because I'm going to talk about them a little bit later, the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK. And the MEK was an organization that thought that they were the ones that were going to prevail after the revolution took place. And then another group called the Fedayeen Islam that has now disappeared, but these were also Marxist Muslims. And then finally, the religionists, the followers of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who wanted Iran to become an Islamic republic and to establish religion as the basis for the state. once again, going back to the 19th century, to the Islamic movement of the 19th century. And Khomeini was old enough so that he actually knew many of the individuals who were involved in the original 19th century Islamic movement. So he had a pedigree that went all the way back to that original Islamic movement. And it's not a surprise that he and his followers wanted to complete the Islamic revolution of the 19th century and establish a new state in the name of Islam, in a way that would repudiate both the rulers of the country and also repudiate foreigners who were interfering in the state. In many ways, the establishment of the Islamic Republic was the completion of the 19th century Islamic revolution that took place throughout the region. So the secular nationalists prevailed for about 6 months, and then the religionists emerged at the time of the hostage crisis, when American diplomats were taken hostage. The MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, was exiled to Iraq, and it remained there, protected by Saddam Hussein, until the fall of Saddam Hussein. The United States protected them. They made sure that they were able to not be attacked by Iranians, and the United States finally arranged with the government of Albania to house them and transported them to Albania. So the United States was actually protecting these revolutionaries who had killed Americans and were designated as a terrorist group for quite a time. The MEK still is in Albania, and as I'll point out in a little bit, the American politicians have regularly been involved with the MEK, and they have regularly stated that they want the Islamic Republic to go away, and they have promised the leaders of the MEK that they will be the rulers of Iran after the religious leaders have disappeared from that situation. So, a hostage crisis. I'm going to go through this very quickly. In the hostage crisis, which took place in November 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini was able to cement his bona fides with his followers through the hostage crisis. And if he had not, he would have likely been deposed, because the hostage takers were operating, they said, in the name of Ayatollah Khomeini. So he had a chance. He could either repudiate them or he could embrace them, and he chose to embrace them in order to make sure that he was not repudiated by the people itself. From the standpoint of the United States, Iran was just an international outlaw violating standards of behavior. We didn't know really who was in charge, ever, but we knew that Iran was bad, and Iran had violated diplomatic principles in taking the hostages, and so Iran became at that point an outlaw nation. So Khomeini outflanked the students, the ideological students who had started this hostage crisis, because they thought that it was going to be something very temporary, just a day or two, but he actually built his entire Islamic Republic on the backs of the hostage crisis people. So from the United States standpoint, he thought that the United States said more or less that Iran should be willing to, and Khomeini should be willing to essentially shoot themselves in the foot to please the United States and to please people with more power. Well, Khomeini was not going to do that. He had been fighting against the Shah's regime for decades and decades, and he was certainly not going to take orders from the United States. But his priorities were directed at solidifying his relationship with his supporters rather than responding to the U.S., with whom he had no relationship whatever. And in fact, he wasn't inclined to have a better relationship with the United States, because the United States was continually insulting him and calling him an outlaw and calling him a murderer. And so there was no room for diplomacy with Ayatollah Khomeini, and I'm not sure that he would have responded to diplomacy anyway. So as a result, Iran abandoned all possibility of friendship with the United States at that point. Most of our problems with Iran, most of our problems today with Iran stem from the hostage crisis. There are people still in Washington, like, for instance, John Bolton, who is not part of the Trump administration now, but was for a brief period of time. He was part of the George W. Bush administration, who are so mad at Iran for the hostage crisis. They will never be satisfied until until the people who actually perpetrated the hostage crisis are punished. And this is this punitive desire in Washington continues down to the present day, 40 years after the hostage crisis actually was perpetrated. So finally, the hostage crisis was resolved. It was resolved according to Iranian cultural patterns. For the United States, the idea was that somehow, we didn't know how, but somehow the Iranians decided to settle the hostage crisis. It was a very mysterious set of negotiations. It was a mediated solution led by third parties, primarily in Algeria, and the Germans were involved and others were involved. To this day, we do not know what took place during the negotiations for the release of the hostages. It still remains mysterious. So the Algerians were an annoyance, evidently, according to people who were there and have an anecdotal memory of the situation, but there was no way to avoid them. Mediation was the way to do it, and it still is, in fact, the only reasonable way to deal with the Iranian government, but the United States is not willing to engage in mediation, certainly not under the Trump administration. The Trump administration wants to be totally in charge. So Iran benefited very little from the hostage crisis, from the negotiations. And this demonstrated to the Iranian public that this was a virtuous matter rather than a materialistic matter. And from the standpoint of the United States, Iran got away with this criminal action and has never been properly punished. And as I say, most of the people in Washington who are involved with the Iranian hostage crisis are hell-bent on punishing Iran today for something that happened 40 years ago. So the Algiers Accords, very interestingly, one of the things that came out as part of the Algiers Accords is that the United States was guaranteed never again to interfere in Iran's internal affairs, never again. Of course, the United States has totally violated the Algiers Accords. When asked about the Algiers Accords by people who are very hostile to Iran, they say, well, we should never have signed it, but we signed it just to get the hostages back. We didn't really mean it. We didn't ever intend to adhere to those accords. But from the standpoint of Iran, they point to the Algiers Accords and they said, the United States signed on a dotted line that they would never again interfere in Iranian affairs. And so what's happening? We're still seeing United States at every turn trying to interfere in Iranian affairs, and actually during the George W. Bush administration, specifically saying that they wanted to have regime change in Iran and to get rid of the Iranian government. So from the United States standpoint, the Algiers Accords were just something that the United States agreed to in order to get the hostages released. They had no meaning. And I'm afraid, as a kind of a mega observation, the United States frequently seems to treat these kinds of agreements and treaties in a very cavalier fashion. If it's expedient at the time, we'll sign it, but then never actually adhere to the agreement in the breach as various organizations go on. So now I want to turn to more recent matters, and this has to do with the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. The IRGC was organized in 1979 following the revolution. It was designed to protect the revolution against potential counter-revolutionary forces, primarily the Iranian army. The religious forces, the Islamic religious forces, were afraid that the army would be loyal to the Shah and that would eventually stage a counter coup and overthrow the revolution. So they established the Revolutionary Guard Corps as another kind of military force to make sure that the revolution and the Islamic Republic would be protected, and especially from the regular army existing in Iran. They also organized the Basij forces. This is an irregular organization of individuals who could be called upon for defense. They were largely young people. And during the war between Iran and Iraq from 1980 to 1988, the Basij were very important. They went to the front lines, and they were young people, and they actually cleared minefields by blowing themselves up. So they were considered to be martyrs, and therefore they gained, as a group, a lot of respect from the Iranian public. A rather horrible way to gain respect, I would say, but they still remain part of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they have a lot of power to, well, frankly, annoy the population with patrolling the streets to make sure that people are behaving properly and that women are properly covered, and they can't be really eliminated because they were formed at the time of the revolution and they're part of the structure. Also, the Quds force is part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the Quds means Jerusalem. And it's a group of between 800 to possibly 2,000 organizational troops that operate exclusively outside of Iran. Now, what the Quds force is designed to do is to essentially provide aid to external Shia communities outside of Iran. Shia communities in Lebanon, Iraq, Bahrain, and Yemen, who largely were oppressed by the governments in that area. In all of these places, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain, the Shia communities are the largest communities in the country. In Syria, it's a little bit different because the ruling family is an offshoot, belongs to an offshoot of Shiism, but they're still the rulers of Syria, even though they're minority rulers. And Iran concluded a mutual defense treaty with Syria during the Iran-Iraq War and are bound by this agreement to defend each other. So Syria would defend Iran in the case of an attack, and Iran would and has defended Syria in the case of an uprising within their country. So the Quds force is very specifically targeted to aiding these Shia communities in these nations. We have an old saying that says, "One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist," and this is undoubtedly true with regard to both the Quds force and also the Shia communities in these countries that are fighting against the repression of their own communities. So the Quds force was active in the Shia resistance in those countries, and one of the Shia resistance forces was Hezbollah in Lebanon. Additionally, they provided aid to Assad in Syria. So I'm going to skip through the next thing because I want to get down to some more contemporary material. But the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980 to 1988 was very important in the history of modern Iran and in the memory of modern Iranians. And one of the reasons was that the United States aided Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War, providing chemical weapons to Iraq and also intelligence to make sure that Iran would not win the war. That was one of the things that the United States was adamant about. They protected and aided Saddam Hussein in order to make sure that Iran would not prevail in the war. After, in 1996, we had an organization that was a group of people who were who were advising Israel. And these are people that you will know. These are neoconservatives. They called for Israel to transcend the Oslo Accords in order to actually subvert and support the removal of governments in the region in order to protect Israel's security. So they suggested regime change throughout the Middle East in order to secure Israel's safety. This is a report that was given to Benjamin Netanyahu in his first term as prime minister in 1996. Then this concretized into a group called the Project for the New American Century in 1988. The project has been disbanded, but their website is still up. It's a neoconservative think tank, and it carried on the mission of the Clean Break Group. 25 of the original signatories served in the Bush administration, including John Bolton, Bill Kristol, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and these groups favored military strategies and called for, again, regime change in Iraq, in Syria, and in Iran. The website is back online. You can go look at their writings calling for the overthrow of the Iranian government. So in 1979, we had sanctions that were placed on Iran. Sanctions were again reimposed in 1987, in 1995, in 2006, but in 2015, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was passed, and the United Nations sanctions were eliminated as a result of diplomacy by the Obama administration. In 2018, however, Trump withdrew from the JCPOA and reimposed the sanctions. And in 2019, Trump increased the sanctions. Now, the pretext for this had to do with Iranian nuclear activity. The Bush administration was not sure that the American public would go along with hostile actions toward Iran, but they already found out that people would support hostile actions against another country if it turned out that there was some kind of nuclear threat from that country. That was Iraq. And the Bush administration invaded Iraq in 2003 on the pretext that Iran had weapons of mass destruction. Iraq did not. But they found out that the American public were massively supportive of this action as long as there was a nuclear threat. So they decided to try it again. And they decided to try it again with regard to Iran. Now, Iran's nuclear activity is a little more complex because we actually started, the United States was involved with Iran's nuclear activity from the very beginning, way back in 1952, during the Eisenhower administration. We supplied nuclear technology to Iran all of the time, from the 1950s down to the present. So the idea that Iran's nuclear activity was somehow a secret was ridiculous. But American memories are short, and if the United States wanted to overthrow the Iranian regime, then using nuclear activity as a pretext was one of the best things that they could possibly do. So Iran, in fact, is bound by the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is pledged never to develop nuclear weapons as a result of this treaty. But Iran is allowed to develop nuclear power for peaceful purposes. So the neoconservatives, started to take a look at, they started to claim that Iran's peaceful development of nuclear power was actually the beginning of the development of a nuclear weapons program. And this accusation was taken up by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, certainly by Benjamin Netanyahu and their other surrogates. But Iran never had an active nuclear weapons program, and it doesn't have one now. The nuclear threat that was leveled against Iran was a total and complete fabrication designed to try to overthrow, to justify the overthrow of the Iranian government And this is payback for the hostage crisis and also the activities in the 1990s by the neoconservatives to try to overthrow Iran's government. I want to talk about Senator Qasem Soleimani, who joined the Revolutionary Guards, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in 1979. He became head of the Quds Force in the late 1990s. And he was not so much a combatant as a successful organizer of non-Iranian militias in Lebanon, in Iraq, in aiding the Syrian government in Syria. He was not a combatant. And remember, the Quds Force consists of only about 800 to, at a maximum, 2,000 forces operating in many, many theaters outside of Iran. So he was active. He was one of the most active people fighting against ISIS in Iraq. And ISIS was a direct threat to Iran because the ISIS organizers were very extreme Sunnis who believed that all Shia Muslims should be killed and murdered. So Iran didn't want ISIS to gain a foothold in Iraq or in Syria or really any place. So he was, the United States probably will never admit that they cooperated with Soleimani in fighting ISIS, but in fact we did. And he was assassinated in January 3rd, 2020 by a United States drone in Baghdad, and no one to this day knows why. The Trump administration has never provided an adequate explanation for his assassination. They knew his whereabouts for years, really, but for some reason, this on January 3rd, 2020, at the time when the Trump impeachment efforts were underway, we get the assassination of a major Iranian military figure. Many journalists and others have said, well, this is an example of the Trump administration creating a distraction in the middle of a situation where they are under real scrutiny by the public. So there are other accusations that have been made against Iran. Iran is the chief state sponsor of terrorism. This isn't even close to being true. It's a slogan. Iran's missile program, non-nuclear missile program, is illegal. It is not. And that Iran continues to develop nuclear weapons. There's no evidence at all that this is true. The neoconservatives' attacks on Iran used false and misleading information to justify regime change. And here's an example. Jerome Corsi, one of the principal neoconservatives writing about, he wrote, among other things, about the swift boats for the swift boating of John Kerry, wrote a book called Atomic Iran, where he claimed that Iran was going to launch nuclear weapons that would bomb Central Park in New York City. So the American Israel Public Affairs Committee continues to promulgate this fantasy propaganda about Iran. Here's a piece of propaganda that you get from AIPAC showing missiles from Iran going to all of the places in the Middle East. It never happened, but the idea that somehow Iran is going to be a major attack force for the region is something they continue to promulgate. So it looks like we're not going to be a friend of Iran for a very long time in the future. And the curious thing is that Iran would like to be friends with Iran again, but we've frustrated these efforts continually. And the Trump administration still embraces the idea of military attacks on Iran. They still want regime change. The neoconservatives in the Trump administration, they are still around. They want the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, to replace the current regime. Here's a statement from John Bolton made on January 14th of 2019, before he was removed as National Security Advisor. It says, the declared policy of the United States should be the overthrow of the mullahs regime in Iran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself And that is why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. This is an address that he made to the MEK in Europe. And I honestly think that Donald Trump has no idea of the background or what is going on here. So we need to return to the JCPOA. We need to find a mediator. We need to talk to Iran. We need much better cultural and educational exchange. We certainly need elimination of sanctions. We need to stop insulting Iran's leaders and look for wins in the economic situation. Now, I want to also very quickly give you a reality check with regard to Iran. The Trump administration regularly presents Iran as a backward nation. The Iranian economy is presented as fragile and likely to collapse as a result of American sanctions. But in fact, Iran is a thoroughly modern nation. It has a robust internal economy. Female participation in commerce and government is extensive. There's an Iranian vice president, female vice president. Food is plentiful in Iran. I just talked to my friends in Shiraz today on the phone. They said that the food stores are completely, the bazaars are completely full of food. There is no food shortage at all. And in fact, they have everything that they need in order to conduct everyday life. Medical treatment in Iran meets a very high international standard despite the shortage of drugs and medical equipment. The industry and technical infrastructure is robust. The country is full of, has modern railroads, modern airlines, modern roads, modern communication, and a modern banking system. So this is anything but a backward nation. There are definitely social problems in Iran. We'd be remiss if we weren't to recognize this. Unemployment, for example, is a very great problem. And since the American sanctions on Iranian economic activity, inflation has been a tremendous problem. There's a strong history of public protest and dynamic participation, democratic participation. We have this all the time in Iran. Every few years, the public erupts in protest. In the United States, we always think that protest is going to result in the overthrow of the government, but it really does not. So someday it may, but although with an authoritarian administration and a very conservative administration, Iran can't be called an absolute dictatorship, as oftentimes the Trump administration characterizes it. So, but despite its basic strength in this current crisis, this current health crisis, the economy is under real additional strain. Let's take a look at the population and economy. You find that, among other things, the total population is 82 million, which makes the idea of an American invasion of Iran rather ridiculous. You take a look at the median age in the far right on the top. Median age is 32 years. 32 years of age is a very young population. Of those 82 million, I would say about 40 million are of fighting age. And if you look at the population, it's about half male, half female. So let's do a little back of the envelope figuring. 82 million people, 32 million under, half of the population under the age of, the median age of the population at 32 years. If we call that 40 million people, discount half of the population, which are women, but women would fight too, I can tell you. You still end up with 20 million people of fighting age who would be willing to defend their country. The United States has no possibility of ever launching any kind of military action. The per capita income is high. It's $20,950 per household. Iran has a lower poverty rate than the United States, even under these current economic conditions. The literacy is 86% for the entire population, 81% for females, and 90% for males. This is a very literate, very well-educated population. Take a look at Iran's GDP. You can see that the growth rate for the GDP in 2017 was 3.76. That was higher than the United States. Now in 2018, after the sanctions were reimposed, the GDP, of course, went down. It was actually negative. But in 2019, it grew again, and so that the GDP was roughly equivalent to some of the best years that Iran had in 2010. And even with the current sanctions, we anticipate that the GDP for Iran this year is going to be in the positive range. Why? Because Iran has a very robust internal economy. And they, even without oil exports, Iran is able to sustain itself. Be interested in the internet growth in Iran. The internet growth is among the highest in certainly the highest in the Middle East, and one of the highest in the world. Out of a total population of 82 million people, there are 123 million mobile subscriptions. 72 million internet users in Iran. That's 89% of the population. I don't believe it's in the United States. Active social media users, 57%. Mobile users, 50%. It's a very, very high proportion of extremely sophisticated people. And these dots represent the Iranian network map. It's all over the country, even in the deserts. I want, as a final note, I want to turn to the question of the COVID-19 crisis in Iran. Iran was one of the earliest countries to experience the COVID-19 crisis. Why? Because Iran has an extraordinarily large number of cooperative ventures with China. The same is true, by the way, with Italy. Italy's fashion industry in the northern part of Italy, around Milan, is very heavily tied in with Chinese manufacturing. Italian high fashion wouldn't exist without its Chinese connections, and Iranian industry these days would not exist without its Chinese connections. So there's been a regular increase in Iran's incidence of the COVID-19 virus. But if you take a look at this, look at the red indicators down at the bottom. You'll see that what has happened is that the Iranian curve has now flattened. If we take a look here, this is not a very easy thing to see, but if you take a look, you'll see that 20 days ago, 20 days from the present, the Iranian curve began to flatten. And Iran is on the verge of actually having a downturn in the virus. The far left lines on this represent the United States. The United States is not, the curve in the United States is not flattening, but the measures that have been taken in Iran with its really excellent medical facilities have resulted in a flattening of the curve, and they are on the verge of having the curve of the virus turned down. Even so, Iran has suffered tremendously as a result of this. It's one of the highest incidences in sheer terms for the COVID-19 virus. And just today, in the Guardian newspaper, and just this morning, I was preparing this lecture, I was alerted to this. World leaders have called for lifting sanctions against Iran. 24 diplomats and defense officials, including 4 former NATO Secretary Generals, have urged Trump to save thousands of lives by easing the medical and humanitarian sanctions on Iran. And this has the backing of many, many world leaders. And including diplomats in the Bush, the Clinton, and the Obama administrations. So Trump reimposed these sanctions in 2018, but we are hoping, this bipartisan group hopes, not for a generalized lifting of the sanctions, that's probably too much to hope for, but a targeted effort to ease the rules that prevent Tehran from trading in medical and humanitarian goods. Now, the sanctions are supposed to exempt medical supplies, but the U.S. Treasury, under Wilbur Ross, has been ignoring these exemptions. And so as a result, Iran has had some terrible problems with its with obtaining medical supplies. They're doing well despite the lack of these medical supplies, but the lifting of sanctions would be would create a much more favorable situation. So the international community is very concerned with this, and these signatories include Madeleine Albright, William Cohen, Chuck Hagel, Hans Blix, the former IAEA head, former U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, and William Burns, lead diplomat on the Iran deal, and also former NATO Secretary General George Robertson. Of course, we would like to see the Trump administration pay attention to these calls for the lifting of sanctions on humanitarian grounds. We probably aren't going to get the Trump administration to lift these sanctions altogether. But on the other hand, the international pressure is always something that, although he doesn't claim to respond to it, something that Trump actually does pay attention to. So we can always hope that this might work out a little better. That's the end of my talk. I've gone on a little bit too long, but I was hoping that we would have time for a few questions. So I'm going to stop this share screen, and we'll be glad to take questions from any of you that might have it. I'm seeing here on the chat screen some questions, does the selling of the, let me read through these questions and I will answer them then. Let's see. Did the selling of patrimony include the selling of licenses for archaeological digs? Well, the Iranian government definitely had to license archaeological digs. And so that the British Institute of Persian Studies, the American Institute of Persian Studies were placed, and the Italians and the Spanish, there were archaeologists all over the place in Iran, and they required Iranian government licenses in order to operate. I can't say that they were actually selling these for a high price, but many Iranian archaeologists were also trained by working on these sites. If any of you ever have a chance to go to Iran, which by the way you can do, many people do throughout the entire world, and you can, when this crisis is over, I definitely suggest that you consider a trip to Iran. If you have a chance to go to the Iranian Archaeological Museum, you'll see some of the many amazing treasures that have been excavated there. Okay, let me take the next question. How likely is Iran to survive the COVID-19 challenges? Is there any truth to the assertion that that the COVID-19 entered Iran by international flights from China? Actually, I answered this already, and yes, it is true. That is undoubtedly how the COVID virus entered Iran, because the Chinese are extremely active right now in economic and construction projects in Iran. As I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago, the curve, the COVID-19 curve has flattened in Iran and is starting to go down. So we're very hopeful that this crisis will eventually disappear in Iran. Oh, I see. The next one is, never mind, you just answered my question. Well, there you go. Now, what is the Iranian stance on the Kurds in the region, and as well as I'm not sure, the Iranian stance with Israel. The Kurds exist in Iran, they exist in Iraq, and they exist in Turkey and also in Syria. The Kurds were deprived of a nation after World War I, during the World War I Accords. The Kurds have a saying, which is, the Kurds have no friends except the mountains. So the Iranian Kurds have been disadvantaged in Iran for some time. The Iranian government has tried to pay a certain amount of attention to the Kurdish region in recent years, and they've done things like, for instance, they've started to allow Kurdish textbooks to appear in schools, and they've tried to do some economic development. The Kurds claim that they still are they're still economically disadvantaged in Iran. But what's most interesting, though, is that Kurds, if you will ask them, they fully consider themselves to be participants in Iranian civilization. They're ethnic Kurds, but Iranian civilization is something that they value, and that is part of their heritage. Now, with regard to Israel, there's been a lot of frankly nonsense that has been promulgated about Iran's stance toward Israel. Iran has never, and I'll just flat out tell you this, Iran has never threatened to destroy Israel. This is a lie. This is something that was promulgated in 2005, when during the month of Ramadan, then President Ahmadinejad quoted Ayatollah Khomeini from 1979, 1980, saying that in the course of time, the occupiers of Jerusalem may disappear. That was the quote. And it was claimed by the Israelis that this was a threat to destroy Israel. It was not a threat to destroy Israel, and Iran has never threatened to destroy Israel. So the principal problem that Iran has with Israel has to do with the Palestinians. Iran is the only country in the Middle East, really, not even other Arab countries, that has really taken up the cause of the Palestinians. If the Palestinian situation could be solved, Iran's problems with Israel would also be solved. The difficulty with regard to Hezbollah had to do with the fact that Israel attacked southern Lebanon in 1979 and 1980. And the Shia communities were under siege from Israel. Israel wasn't attacking them, they were attacking Palestinian refugees that had been making incursions over the border. But the Lebanese government would not protect the Shia in the southern part of Lebanon. So Iran, fresh from the revolution, came into southern Lebanon, organized Hezbollah as a Shia defense force, and that's the situation there. If Israel had no interest in attacking Shia communities in Lebanon or in Syria, then Iran and Hezbollah would have no hostility toward Israel. Now, there may be ideological hostility toward Israel, and certainly Israel has had a lot of hostility toward Iran. But as for a physical threat to Israel, there is none, and there never has been. Russia seems to have a difficult history with Iran, yet today is an ally. Yeah, it's a very, very curious ally. The Iranians do not trust the Russians at all. They're willing to take the help of the Russians, but they always have felt, and they will tell you today, that they think that the Russians are self-interested and that the Russians are looking to exploit their relationship with Iran. So in the fact that the United States is so hostile to Iran, and that the Russians have stepped in and said, yeah, we'll figure out a way for you to get foreign exchange. We'll figure out a way for you to spend your money. We'll also help you with your nuclear program. So the Iranians have reluctantly accepted this Russian aid, but they do not trust them. They expect that someday, the bill is going to come due and they're not going to like the results. And this distrust goes all the way back to the 19th century. And I can tell you many, many stories about how the Russians cheated the Iranians during the 19th century. And even today, although, as I say, they're willing to accept the help that the Russians are giving them, they believe that the Russians are totally self-interested in what they're doing. At least before the election of Trump, this is the next question, it's often said that Iranian attitude toward the U.S. is positive. It is today. It is today. That is, the leaders of Iran are pretty frustrated with the United States. But the people of Iran are extremely positive toward the United States. This is a seeming paradox. And if you will, if you have a chance to travel to Iran, and as people do, the American tourists that travel to Iran are astonished. They are completely blown away by the hospitality they receive from ordinary Iranians, who actually come out and tell them that they love Americans, they love American culture, they love American civilization. So we have a very strange situation here, where the Iranian people are perhaps the people in the Middle East, maybe outside of Israel, who are the most positively disposed to the United States. The Iranian leaders are, of course, not so positively disposed, because the United States has done a lot of really, really nasty things to Iran. And it's been very difficult for us to deal with the Iranian leaders. How do you read the politics between the United States and Europe regarding the nuclear agreement? Why hasn't the EU been able to resist the US imposed sanctions? The reason that Europe hasn't been able to resist the sanctions is because almost all international trade is denominated in dollars. And the United States, the EU there's no problem with the EU dealing with Iran in terms of trade, but they can't avoid using dollar-denominated trade operations. And the US has said, you can trade, but you can't use dollars, and you can't use anything that's connected to dollars. You can't use anything that's connected to the US Treasury. And we are the world currency. The EU has come up with some little teeny kind of carve out of the economic system that somehow avoids dollar-denominated transactions. But thus far, it's been extraordinarily ineffective. The Russians also have tried to figure out an exchange system that avoids dollars, and thus far that has also failed. So, unfortunately, that's a shame. But the Europeans did not want the lifting of the JCPOA. They still technically are still engaged with Iran in the JCPOA. It hasn't gone away. The agreement is still there. It's just that the United States isn't adhering to it, and Iran has made some symbolic gestures to sort of violate little teeny provisions of it, just to show that they're upset with the situation. So let's see. The next one is, what happened to Mossadegh? Well, Mossadegh retired. He went to his home in Mazandaran, and he died in his bed. He was his children are still there in Iran. They're well known. It's fortunate. Mossadegh wasn't executed. He was allowed to retire, and he led a peaceful life until his death. He was already quite old in 1952, so he didn't live that much longer after 1952. In their most recent report, Amnesty International reports that hundreds of people were killed by Iranian security forces in the country last year. And historically, Amnesty reports that thousands of Iranians disappeared by Iranian security forces in the late 1980s. Can you talk briefly about the human rights situation in Iran? the human rights situation is indeed very bad in Iran. Iran has incarcerated and executed really thousands and thousands of political prisoners. It is one of the most serious human rights situations in the world, and Iranians know this. And this is one of the reasons for a lot of social protests. Something that we, that those of us who work in Iran are extremely upset about. And I don't want to engage in whataboutism here, but I should point out to you that there's a cultural pattern. Under the Shah, you had an absolutely similar situation where political prisoners were arrested and executed by the thousands and tortured. And the security forces under the Shah, after the establishment of the Islamic Republic, were the same security forces, same leaders, everything. And so there is an unfortunate culture of unfortunate culture of oppression, of political thought, and arrests in Iran that continues to the present day. Iranian leaders have expressed a great admiration for the Chinese because the way the formula goes, they say the Chinese have managed to deliver material wealth to their population, but at the same time, they've been able to keep the lid on political protests. And that is something that Iranians think, that the Iranian leaders think is a great thing. You want people to be comfortable, you want them to have televisions and cars and all that stuff. But at the same time, you want to make sure that political protest is suppressed. When there does get to be real difficulties with the Iranian population, when they rise up in protest, sometimes it's about consumer issues, like, for instance, raising the price of gasoline. But sometimes it's about freedom and political repression. And the Iranians are not unsophisticated. They know what's going on in the world. They get CNN on their satellite dishes. The government has tried to keep them from doing that. They've tried to block internet news. When I was last in Iran, they blocked Google, which the Chinese also do. Last time I was in Iran, it was a couple years ago, we at the University of Minnesota, we used Google for our email, so I couldn't get my email. And I went to one of my friends and I said, is there anything that you know to do? And he says, well, don't you have a blocker on your phone? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, oh, well, here. And he put a little app on my phone and it completely bypassed all of the government censorship. So everybody knows how to do this. This was a 16-year-old kid. So this is a problem, and we would be remiss if we didn't point this out. And of course, Iranians themselves regularly do this. And when we find instances of really terrible oppression, those of us who are concerned with Iran do not hesitate to condemn it. One of my colleagues, a French anthropologist, Fariba Adelkha, is now being held in Iran under very sketchy circumstances. She's been on a hunger strike. She has done nothing. She's a really wonderful academic, and we hope that she'll be released. But she's a French citizen, so we can't do very much from the part of the United States. The next question here, was the James Clavell novel Whirlwind relatively accurate in the depiction of the Iranian culture during the late 70s? There's a lot in Clavell's novel that is accurate. So I was there. I lived in Iran at that time. I went through the Iranian Revolution, and I departed about a month after Khomeini arrived in Iran. He wasn't there for the hostage crisis. Of course, many of my friends and colleagues, many of them were Iranian studies individuals, they They lived through not only the revolution, but also through the hostage crisis, and were hostages. It's surprising how few of them have negative views of Iran today. Even though they went through that whole more than a year, 444 days of hostage crisis. Clavel has written a novel, but the novel has a ring of truth about it. I would recommend a novel for you, for those of you who would like to see this. This is a novel called "To Keep the Sun Alive." It's a novel written by a wonderful writer named Rabeh Ghaffari, Ghaffari, and it's a novel about the Iranian Revolution and what happened in one of the provincial towns. It's based roughly on true people and true circumstances. So, To Keep the Sun Alive, a wonderful novel, and I'm sure you would really enjoy reading it. Surely not all, the next question, surely not all the dishonesty and stupidity in U.S.-Iran relations is on the U.S. side. How has Iran erred in those relations after the overthrow of the Shah? Well, Iran was disposed to pretty heavily demonize the United States. No question about it. And I've written a whole book about this. It's called The Great Satan versus the Mad Mullahs, How the United States and Iran Demonize Each Other. And if the characterization of the United States, that the United States has toward Iran is inaccurate, there's plenty of inaccuracy in the characterization of the United States by Iran and by Iranian leaders. And the difficulty here is that, we're not in contact with each other anymore. And so the understandings can be rather absurd sometimes, or misunderstandings can be rather absurd. I'll give you an example. I was in Iran, and I had a friend who was a journalist and from Seattle, and he came into contact with one of the intelligence officials. And when the person said that that he was from Seattle, the intelligence official thought for a minute, and he said, "So you're a spy, right?" My friend said, "No, I'm not a spy. I'm a journalist. Here's my credentials. I really am a journalist." He said, "No," he said, "you have to be a spy." And so my friend said, "Well, why do you say that?" And he says, "Do you know the name of the newspaper in Seattle?" And my friend said, "You mean the Post-Intelligencer?" And he says, "Yes, intelligence." So there are a lot of very, very silly misunderstandings that people have, and some of them are more dangerous than others. That's a rather frivolous example, of course. But I rather than go through story after story, I certainly recommend my book if you'd like to read about how the Iranians have also misunderstood the United States in many ways. The next question, do Iranian men continue to go to Syria to fight? Not now. And there's no right now in this current situation, there's no transport of Iranian men to Syria, and there never really was very many. There were very few Iranian men actually went to Syria to fight. They were mostly people who were attached with the Quds force. So the Quds force was there actually organizing the Syrian army, and also they were organizing Hezbollah, who was fighting alongside the Syrian government forces. Why? Because the Syrian forces were really afraid. The Hezbollah was really afraid. Being a Shia defense force, they were afraid first that the Sunni majority Sunni population in Syria would gain the upper hand, and then would begin to make incursions into Lebanon. But they were mostly afraid of ISIS. ISIS was hell-bent on killing Shia, and they would have executed all of the Alawites in Syria that they possibly could have, and then started on the Shia communities in Lebanon. So that was the principal reason why they were involved. And aside from that, of course, the connection between Iran and Lebanon was bridged through Syria. So Shia in Iraq, Shia in and the Shia-dominated government in Syria, and then Hezbollah in Lebanon forms a bridge, an international bridge, and that was something that Iranians were interested in protecting for strategic reasons. Next question. 10 years ago, I read a book by a journalist with an Iranian background. He said that in Iran, people talked about politics. Cab drivers would immediately start complaining about politicians. He visited Syria and no one would talk. I get the idea that Iranians speak up more than you would expect. Oh yes, given the circumstances. Is there truth in that? This is an Iranian-American journalist who went to Iran to report. No question about it. The Iranians will not mince words. They'll tell you flat out that they think that their leaders, their political leaders, are fools, and they'll go farther than that. They'll say, this person is an idiot, and I don't care who knows it. So they are quite outspoken. And one of the other great things here is that Iran's female population are maybe even more outspoken than the men. They're bright, they're intelligent, they're political leaders, they are economic leaders, and I think that I actually anticipate that sometime during the remainder of my lifetime, we're going to see a female president of Iran. I'm sure it will happen. These are intrepid, very talented women, and also quite outspoken. So thank you. Someone thanked me very much. Ellen Knight, thanks. Let's see, I can't read this quite right. But thank you very much, Ellen, for thanking me for this talk. And I'm going to answer one more question, and then I think we're going to stop because it's now 8:30 your time. And this last question is, what's Bars and Holly? Oh, hi, Bars. Hi, Holly. Other than obtaining power, what is the political ideology of the MEK? That's it. That's it. They want to be in power. Well, and they're Marxists, so they'd like to impose a Marxist government on Iran. But frankly, the MEK is a cult. There was an article, about a month ago in the New York Times. The New York Times reporter got into the camp in Albania, wrote a very, very interesting report. He also said that, that in this camp in Albania, there practically was nobody there. So I don't know how they expect to take over the government of Iran, but they are after power. And as I say, their ideology, their Marxist ideology, derived from the work of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, is one of the driving forces. But they've become very militaristic. They have attacked people who've attacked them, but they seem to have gotten a lot of currency in Washington, and not only with John Bolton, but Sam Brownback actually gave them a desk in his office when he was senator from Kansas, and Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, who's now retired from the House of Representatives from Florida, she also supported them. And during the Bush administration, they got a boost of about $75 million from the Bush administration that was funneled through a bill. Well, thank you all very much. I'm perfectly happy to have you write me at wbeeman@umn.edu, and I hope this was an interesting and enjoyable talk. So thanks again. I will. This has been recorded. I will send the social committee at the Bridgewater a link to this talk. And if any of you are coming in from outside of the Bridgewater and might not be on that network, please just email me. I'll send you a link in case you would like to review some of the things I've said. So thanks again, and